The moving truck had her name on nothing inside it. Dean had labeled every box, every piece of
Yes, I'm looking
furniture,
at it right now.
every
The
lamp and
place has
picture
changed, but
frame
not
with little
much.
green
I'll call you
stickers that
back.
said Calloway Estate Retain. As if the word retain could erase 50 years of a woman choosing those curtains, painting those walls, placing those frames with her own two hands. Edith Mee Calloway
You
stood in the
have to hear
driveway of the
this.
house she'd entered as a bride in 1974 and watched two
The
strangers in
trust
gray
stipulates that upon
uniforms carry her
execution, all
dining
assets are to
table
be
through the
distributed.
front door.
This includes the real
She
estate
didn't
holdings and
stop them.
investment accounts.
She didn't say a word. She held a single cardboard box against her chest, photographs, her mother's letters, a Bible with a cracked spine, and stood there in the cold November air like a woman watching her own funeral from across the street. She was 72 years old. Everything she'd built across half a century fit inside one box. Dean walked past her without making eye contact. He was on the phone with the real estate agent, discussing staging timelines and paint colors. His voice was clipped and efficient, the voice of a man closing a transaction, not burying a marriage. She heard him say, "We can list by the 15th if we push the painters." The 15th. 11 days after putting his father in the ground, and Dean was already painting over her life. Philip sat in his car at the curb, engine running, scrolling his phone. He hadn't come inside, hadn't looked at her once. These were the men she'd raised, not from her body, but from her hands, her patience, her years. She'd packed their school lunches, driven them to practice, stayed up through fevers, ironed shirts for graduations and job interviews. She'd done all of it without being asked and without being thanked, because she believed that love didn't need a receipt. She believed that 50 years of showing up would speak for itself when the time came. The time had come, and it said nothing. Walter Calloway died on a Sunday morning 3 weeks ago. Quietly, the way he did everything. No drama, no last words. Just a man who went asleep beside his wife and didn't wake up. Edith brought him coffee at 7 like she'd done every morning for 50 years. The mug was still warm when she realized his chest wasn't moving. She sat beside him for 40 minutes before calling anyone, holding his hand, telling him about the weather, telling him the rose bushes needed cutting back. She told him she loved him because she'd been saying it for 5 decades and stopping felt like releasing a rope. She'd gripped her entire adult life. Walter had been a county land surveyor. Not a lawyer, not a businessman, not a man who commanded rooms. A man who measured ground. He spent his career walking through forests and up ridgelines with a tripod and a level, mapping property lines across rural West Virginia. He came home smelling like pine needles and red clay. He spoke more to his topographic maps than to most people. He was gentle, steady, and maddeningly unreachable, and Edith had loved him with the kind of devotion that never asks for anything back. She'd been 22 when they married, a schoolteacher, first year, fourth graders. Walter was 30 with 2 small boys and a dead wife and no idea how to hold his world together. He needed someone. She needed to be needed. That equation carried them for 50 years. Now she stood in a driveway watching strangers dismantle the answer. What Edith didn't know, what she wouldn't discover for another 9 days, was that Walter had not been the simple, quiet man she believed she'd married. The weekend trips he'd taken monthly for 50 years, the ones he always said were for work, had never been for work. His silence wasn't absence. It was the most deliberate act of protection she would ever encounter. And the proof was waiting in a place she'd never been, behind a door that only a hand-carved key could open. But first, she had to survive what was coming. And what was coming would test whether 50 years of swallowed silence had left her broken or loaded.
I need to tell you about the funeral before I tell you what happened after, because the funeral is where I first understood I was alone. Not lonely. I'd been lonely inside my marriage for years, though I'd never have admitted it while Walter was alive. This was different. This was the kind of alone where you realize the ground you've been standing on was never yours, and everyone around you is waiting for you to step off it so they can measure the lot. Walter's service was at Grace Hill Baptist, the church we'd attended 31 years. I'd arranged flowers for that altar more times than I could count, organized potlucks in the basement, taught Sunday school in the back room. I knew every crack in those wooden floors. Dean and Philip organized the funeral without asking me a single question. Not about the music, the readings, not which suit Walter would have wanted. When I called Dean, he said, "We've got it handled, Edith. You just focus on yourself." It sounded like kindness. It wasn't. It was a door closing. They seated me in the second row. Philip's wife, Brenda, sat in front, Brenda, who'd met Walter maybe 40 times in 20 years. She was in the front row, and I was behind her, staring at the back of her head during the eulogy of the man I'd slept beside for half a century. 6 people spoke. Walter's boss from the county office, a college friend I'd never met, Dean, Philip, a neighbor, and a man named Harlan Briggs who said he'd worked with Walter on surveying projects in West Virginia, a man I'd never heard of, never seen at our home, never known existed. Harlan looked directly at me. His eyes were red and his voice shook, and he said something that didn't make sense at the time. Walter spent his whole life making sure the right things ended up in the right hands. He was the most patient man I ever knew. Patient, not kind, not generous, patient, like Walter had been waiting for something. After the service, Harlan found me in the parking lot, 75 at least, leathery skin, wearing a suit that didn't fit right. He pressed my hand between both of his and leaned close. "He talked about you every single day out there. Don't forget that." Then he walked away before I could ask what he meant. I stood there and felt something shift inside my chest. Not grief, I understood grief. This was different. The first crack in a wall I didn't know existed. Walter talked about me, every day, out there. My husband averaged 30 words a day at home. Where had he been spending all his sentences? Dean called 2 days later. "Edith, we need to talk about the house. There are some things in Dad's will you should probably sit down for." The way he said probably sit down, I've replayed it 1,000 times since. There was something in his voice, not sympathy, not regret, satisfaction. The tone of a man who's been holding a winning card and finally gets to lay it down. I should have heard what was underneath those words. But 50 years of trusting the people closest to me had made me deaf to betrayal delivered in a polite voice. What I heard in that conference room 3 days later tore apart everything I believed about my marriage, my husband, and my place in the family I'd given my adult life to build. And the worst part, the part that still keeps me awake, is that Dean smiled the entire time. He smiled while he erased me. If this story is hitting close to home, if you've ever poured your whole heart into people who treated your love like it was disposable, drop the word invisible in the comments right now. Because what Edith discovers next proves that the people this world overlooks are sometimes the ones being protected the most. You don't want to miss what was waiting behind that door. Hi viewers, I want to ask you something personal and I need an honest answer. Have you ever given someone the best years of your life and then been told it wasn't enough? Tell me how many years. Just drop the number in the comments. Because every single one of those years counted, even if they never said so. And Edith's story is about to prove exactly why.
The conference room at Whitmore and Price smelled like furniture polish and old paper. Edith sat at one end of the walnut table by herself. Dean and Philip sat at the other with a sharp-faced attorney named Garrett Webb, who tapped his pen against a legal pad like he was counting down. Martin Whitmore, the estate attorney, sat at the head. He'd handled Walter's affairs for 22 years. He'd complimented Edith's cooking at dinner parties. Today, he wouldn't meet her eyes. He opened with formalities, then got to specifics. The family residence at 14 Prescott Lane, Brookline, Massachusetts, currently valued at approximately $485,000, is left in its entirety to my sons, Dean Robert Calloway and Philip James Calloway. Edith's fingers tightened on the chair arms. Her house, the house where she'd raised those 2 boys, hung wallpaper, replaced a roof, spent Christmas mornings and summer evenings and every ordinary Tuesday for 50 years. Gone. One sentence. All savings and checking accounts totaling approximately $340,000 are to be divided equally between Dean Robert Calloway and Philip James Calloway. Money she'd helped save by cooking every meal at home, mending clothes instead of buying new ones, clipping coupons, choosing the cheaper brand for 5 decades so those numbers could grow. Given to two men who spent more on a single vacation than Edith spent in a year. My pension benefits and life insurance policy, valued at approximately $190,000, are to be distributed equally between my two sons. Dean shifted in his chair, not with discomfort, with satisfaction, the way a man shifts when he's settling into a seat he's been waiting to claim. Martin paused. He removed his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on, and read the next section in a voice gone flat and careful. To my wife, Edith Me Calloway, I leave my personal effects and any items of sentimental value she wishes to collect from the residence within 14 days. Personal effects, 14 days, 50 years reduced to whatever she could carry in 2 weeks. The room went so quiet Edith could hear the pen still tapping on Garrett Webb's legal pad. Tap, 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 like a clock running out. Dean spoke first. Dad updated the will about 14 months ago. He wanted to make sure the family assets stayed within the bloodline. He paused, letting the word hang in the air. I'm sure you understand, Edith. You were always more of a caretaker than a financial partner. Caretaker. 50 years of holding his hand through surgeries, sitting with him through funerals, sharing every quiet evening, and Dean called her a caretaker. Like she'd been hired and her contract had expired. Philip said nothing. He examined his phone with the concentration of a man deliberately looking anywhere except at the woman sitting across the table from him. Martin cleared his throat. There is one additional item. He turned a page. A handwritten addendum added approximately 6 months before Walter's death. It reads, Edith knows where to find what matters. She has the key. Silence. Dean frowned. What key? What is that supposed to mean? Martin shook his head. Walter added this himself, properly witnessed, but he didn't explain its meaning to me. Sentimental nonsense, Philip said without looking up. Dad got emotional toward the end. You know how he was. But Edith wasn't listening to Philip. She was remembering something. 3 months before Walter died, she'd found objects in his coat pocket while doing laundry. A hand-carved wooden key, small, oddly warm to the touch, with a pattern of overlapping mountain ridges cut into the handle, and a folded piece of paper with nothing written on it but a set of numbers, GPS coordinates. She'd asked Walter about them. He'd taken them from her hands gently and said, Just work things, Eddie. Don't worry about it. She'd slipped them into her jewelry box when he wasn't looking. She kept them because they smelled like pine, and pine smelled like Walter. Now those coordinates sat in her jewelry box inside a house that would belong to Dean in 14 days. And for the first time since her husband died, Edith felt something move through the numbness. Not hope. Not yet. Something more dangerous than hope. Curiosity. The kind that pulls at you when everything safe has already been taken away and the only direction left is forward into the unknown. That night Edith sat alone at the kitchen table in a house that was no longer hers. She unfolded the worn piece of paper and typed the coordinates into her phone with trembling fingers. The pin dropped in the middle of Appalachian wilderness, a road without a name, a county she'd never visited, a town that barely existed on any map. Ridgecrest, West Virginia, population 412, and for the first time since Walter died, Edith felt something other than grief. She felt afraid. But beneath the fear, and this was the part she couldn't explain, something was pulling her toward that pin on the screen like a rope knotted around her ribs. Dean brought the real estate agent on day 3. Her name was Valerie, and she wore heels that clicked across the hardwood floors Edith had refinished by hand 12 years ago. Valerie walked through every room photographing and dictating notes into her phone while Edith sat eating toast at the kitchen table. Neither Valerie nor Dean acknowledged her presence. She might as well have been part of the furniture. The kitchen needs updating, Valerie said, running a manicured finger along the countertop Edith had chosen in 1996. Buyers want quartz now. This laminate dates the whole space. She opened a cabinet. We'll clear all personal items before staging, obviously. Obviously. 50 years of carefully arranged dishes, handed down serving platters and the coffee mug Walter drank from every single morning. Obviously, all cleared. On day 5, Philip arrived with movers, not to help Edith pack, to inventory furniture. 2 men with clipboards walked through the house tagging pieces while Philip directed from the living room. Edith's rocking chair, the one she'd sat in through 3 miscarriages and 1 stillbirth that nobody in this family ever discussed, received a green sticker that read staging, living room, SW corner. She hadn't expected the chair to hurt that much. Watching a stranger sticker the place where she'd held her stomach and cried for bobbies that never came, that was when Edith understood she wasn't losing property. She was being cleaned out of existence. On day 6, she called Martin Whitmore, the original will, the one Walter wrote 15 years ago. What did it say? Long silence on the line. Edith, I probably shouldn't be telling you this. Martin, please. He exhaled heavily. The original left everything to you. House, accounts, pension, all of it. Dean and Philip received modest trusts of $50,000 each. Walter was very clear about his wishes. He said you'd earned every penny, and the boys had been given enough advantages already. Edith gripped the phone until the case cracked against her palm. The will changed 14 months ago, Martin continued, his voice dropping lower. Walter came in with Dean. He was recovering from his stroke. His hands were shaking. Dean did most of the talking. Walter signed the new version, properly witnessed, so legally I can't challenge it. He paused. But I asked Walter 3 times if this was what he truly wanted. Each time he looked at Dean before answering. Edith hung up and sat very still. Through the kitchen window she could see her garden, rosebushes heavy with the last blooms, the herb bed still green, the perennial border she designed to flower from March through November. All of it about to be ripped out for professional landscaping that would photograph well in the listing. On day 8 she found the journal. Emptying Walter's nightstand, the clock ticking, a drawer stuck. She pulled harder and the bottom panel shifted, revealing a gap between the drawer and the frame. Wedged inside was a small leather journal, dark brown, worn smooth at the edges. She'd never seen it before. Not once in 50 years of making that bed and dusting that nightstand. The first page stopped her cold. Written in Walter's careful, slanted handwriting, for Edith, read this at the cabin, not before. A cabin she'd never heard of, never been told about in 50 years of marriage. She turned the journal in her hands. It smelled like pine and wood smoke, the scent Walter carried home from every one of those weekend trips. 50 years of that smell, and she'd never once asked the right questions. On day 12, Edith packed her car before sunrise. 3 suitcases, 1 box of photographs, her mother's Bible, the key, the coordinates, Walter's journal. She left the rocking chair. She left the green stickers. She drove away from Prescott Lane at 6 in the morning while the street was dark. As the house disappeared from her rear view, she felt the strangest sensation. Not sadness, relief. The terrifying, weightless relief of a woman who has stopped gripping something that was never holding her back. The GPS said 4 hours and 47 minutes to Ridgecrest, West Virginia. Walter's journal sat on the passenger seat. The key hung from a cord around her neck. And somewhere ahead, in hills she'd never seen, the man she thought she knew had been building something for 50 years in total silence. She just didn't know yet whether it would save her or finish breaking her apart. The highway gave way to county roads outside Charleston. County roads became 2-lane blacktop through valleys so deep the sun only hit pavement in patches. Then blacktop turned to gravel. The GPS flickered twice and stabilized with a thin blue line pointing deeper into the hills. No other cars for 20 minutes. Forest pressing close, old-growth oak and hemlock, trunks massive enough that 2 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. The road climbed, switching back, and with each turn the world she'd known shrank behind her. A faded sign read Ridgecrest 4 miles. Hand-painted, white on green, nailed to a wooden post leaning 15 degrees. Below the town name someone had added in different handwriting, "Still here." Ridgecrest appeared around a final bend like a photograph from another decade. Main Street 300 yards long, a general store with a metal roof, a diner with checked curtains, a post office the size of a shed, a white church needing paint, a library built from river stone, 2 gas pumps. The town wasn't dead, but it was holding its breath. Edith stopped at the diner because she hadn't eaten since Beckley and needed solid ground before driving the rest of the way. The sign read Mies. The woman behind the counter matched mid-60s, strong arms, silver hair, faded apron over flannel. She was pouring coffee when Edith walked in. The bell rang, Mies looked up, the pot stopped mid-pour. "You're Edith," not a question, a confirmation she'd been rehearsing for years. "How do you know my name?" "Honey, everyone here knows your name. Walter showed us your picture so many times I could have picked you from a stadium." Mies came around the counter. "Sit. Coffee and pie before you go up that hill." Edith sat because her legs decided. Mies brought coffee, then sat across from her. "Walter came here every month for 50 years, sometimes twice. Ate at this counter nearly every visit. Ham and eggs, black coffee, slice of whatever pie I had. Never changed his order once in 5 decades." Edith's hand trembled around the mug. "He told me those trips were for work." "They were work," Mies said carefully, "just not the kind you're thinking." Mies leaned back. "Your husband wasn't just visiting. He was the reason this town still exists. 12 years ago, Holcomb Energy tried buying every parcel in this valley. Half the families were ready to sell. Walter convinced them not to, went door to door with maps and data, told them their land was worth more than anyone was offering. Walter did that," her voice cracked on his name. "And more, he bought land himself, parcel by parcel, year after year, quiet, careful, making sure nobody outside this valley knew what he was doing." Mies paused. "He put every acre in your name, Edith, not his, yours." The diner went still. The man at the counter turned to listen. Everyone watching Edith with recognition, relief, and something like gratitude, as if she'd arrived to claim a post they'd been guarding for decades. "He talked about you every single visit," Mies said softly. "How smart you were, how strong. He said keeping this place hidden from his boys was the hardest thing he ever did. Said they'd destroy it if they ever found out." "Why didn't he tell me?" Mies covered Edith's hand. "He was protecting you, and he was afraid of something his boys might find out about what this land is sitting on." She stood and pulled a basket from behind the counter, bread, eggs, jam, coffee. "That's not my story to tell. Walter left it at the cabin. Roads rough. Stay in low gear." She met Edith's eyes. "Whatever you find up there, he built every piece of it for you." Edith drove the logging road with those words filling the car. Gravel to packed dirt, trees closing overhead, light turning green and gold and cathedral still. Walter had spent 50 years coming to this place. 50 years of secrets, a parallel life she never knew existed. And whatever he'd been protecting, whatever was worth half a century of silence, it was behind that door. The trees opened into a clearing. Edith stopped the car and sat still, both hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at something that made no sense. Because this was not a ruin, not a hunting shack rotting in the woods. This was a home, stone and timber, set into the hillside like the mountain itself had grown it. Solar panels on the roof, wildflowers in window boxes someone had been tending, a covered porch facing east over the entire valley, smoke stains around the chimney, a rain barrel at the corner, everything weathered but cared for, like something loved quietly for a very long time. And it had been waiting for her. The key fit. That was the first thing that undid her. A hand-carved wooden key, rough and warm against her fingers, sliding into an iron lock on an oak door in the middle of the West Virginia hills, and it fit perfectly, like a sentence finishing itself. The door swung open without a sound, and Edith stepped across the threshold into air that smelled like cedar, old paper, and something mineral and clean, like the earth underneath a river stone. The cabin was warm, not stale warm, not closed-up warm. The kind of warm that meant someone had designed this place to hold heat the way good hands hold a child, steady, intentional, without ever needing to be asked. Edith would later learn it was a geothermal system Walter had installed himself, running pipes deep into the hillside and pulling warmth from the ground. But standing in that doorway for the first time, she didn't know any of that. She just knew the cold that had lived inside her chest for 3 weeks, loosened by a single degree. The main room was open and simple, wide plank floors, dark with age and decades of careful oiling. A stone fireplace built from the same gray rock as the exterior walls. A leather chair by the window, worn soft on the arms and the seat, shaped by years of one body sitting in it. Bookshelves covering an entire wall, not decorative, not staged, but filled with volumes that had been read and reread, spines cracked, pages marked with torn strips of paper. And maps everywhere, pinned to a corkboard above a massive drafting table, rolled in tubes stacked in the corner, spread flat under glass on a side table. Topographic maps of the surrounding hills covered in Walter's handwriting, circles drawn in red ink, arrows pointing to specific ridgelines, notations in a shorthand code Edith didn't recognize. Numbers, coordinates, dates spanning decades. She walked to the drafting table and ran her fingers across the surface. It was smooth, polished by years of Walter's forearms resting against it. A pencil sat in the groove at the top, sharpened to a fine point. A compass and a protractor lay beside it, tools of his trade, arranged with the precision of a man who found meaning in measurement. Then she saw the photographs. Not on the walls here, not of her, not like Peggy's story. These were photographs of Ridgecrest, dozens of them framed and hung in chronological order along the hallway that led to the kitchen. The town in the 1970s, the mine still operating, trucks on the road, families on porches. Then the 1980s, the mine closed, buildings boarded, streets empty. The slow dying of a place. And then, starting in the mid-1990s, something changed. The same buildings repaired, new paint on the church, the library reopened, children outside the school, a garden where there had been a parking lot, a timeline of a town that almost died and somehow didn't. Walter had documented it all, every stage, every recovery, and his handwriting was on the back of every photograph, dating it, noting what had changed and why. The kitchen was small and functional, a wood stove alongside a modern propane range, copper pots on hooks, a deep farmhouse sink. The pantry was stocked with canned goods, dry pasta, rice, coffee, enough for months. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms simply furnished. The master had windows facing east over the valley, and in the morning light that would pour through those windows, Edith could already imagine waking here and feeling something she hadn't felt in decades, that the day ahead belonged to her. She came back downstairs and stood at Walter's drafting table. She pulled the leather journal from her coat and set it down beside his pencil. Then she opened it to where she'd left off. The first entry was dated June 1974, 3 months after their wedding. Went to Ridgecrest today. Uncle Hank's land is exactly what I suspected. The mining company left because they thought the coal was spent. They were looking for the wrong thing. Edith turned the page. The handwriting shifted tighter, underlined twice, the kind of pressure that dents paper. The geological survey confirms it. These hills aren't sitting on coal anymore. They're sitting on something the mining companies never tested for, something worth more than they could imagine, and nobody knows except me. Edith closed the journal. Her hands were shaking. Not from cold, the cabin was impossibly warm, but from the slow, staggering realization that the man she'd called quiet, the man who barely spoke at dinner, who she thought had no ambitions beyond his county maps, had been sitting on a secret for 50 years. He'd left it all to her. But she hadn't found the letter yet, the one sealed inside the drafting table's hidden drawer, and that letter would explain not just what Walter found, but why he spent his entire life making sure nobody else ever did. The drawer didn't look like a drawer. It looked like a knot in the wood, a dark, circular imperfection on the left side of the drafting table, the kind of thing you'd run your fingers over without thinking. Edith had been sitting at the table for 2 hours, reading Walter's journal entry by entry, when her thumb caught the edge of that knot and it gave. A panel slid sideways with a soft click, revealing a compartment no bigger than a shoebox, lined with felt. Inside were 3 things. A sealed envelope, thick and cream-colored, with "My beloved Edith" written across it in Walter's hand, a USB drive in a small plastic case, and a modern brass key attached to a tag that read First Mountain Bank, Ridgecrest, Box 114. Edith picked up the envelope first. The paper was heavy stock, sealed with wax, the kind of gesture that belonged to another century. She broke the seal and unfolded 4 pages of Walter's most careful handwriting. No shorthand here, no surveyor's code, just plain words from a man who knew this was the last thing his wife would ever hear him say. "My dearest Edith, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you found the cabin. I need you to understand something before anything else. The will was a lie, every word of it. I wrote it to be cruel on purpose, because cruelty was the only language Dean would believe." Edith stopped breathing for a moment, then kept reading. 14 months ago, Dean found records of land purchases I'd made in West Virginia. He pressured me during my stroke recovery to change the will. He said if I didn't cut you out, he'd hire investigators to trace every property I'd touched. He'd find Ridgecrest. He'd take it all. So I gave him what he wanted. I rewrote the will to make it look like you meant nothing. Language so harsh that Dean would stop looking. If he believed I'd reduced you to domestic help, he'd have no reason to search for hidden assets. Edith pressed her palm flat against the page. The paper was warm under the desk lamp. "Here is the truth. These hills contain significant deposits of rare earth minerals, lithium, cobalt, neodymium, essential for batteries, electronics, renewable energy. I discovered this in 1974 through private geological surveys. Nobody else knows. If this became public, Holcomb Energy would strip mine every hill within a year. They've been buying old mining land across Appalachia for decades. They got close to Ridgecrest 12 years ago. I stopped them. Over 50 years, I purchased 17 parcels of land surrounding Ridgecrest, always in your name, always through separate trusts funded by Uncle Hank's inheritance, never commingled with our joint finances. Total acreage, 843 acres. Current value based on mineral rights, conservatively $14 million. But the money isn't the point. The land trust I established prevents any mining without the landowner's explicit written consent. That consent cannot be sold, transferred, or inherited. It exists only as long as you do, unless you designate a successor. Edith set the letter down and stared at the maps on the wall. The red circles, the arrows, the decades of notations. Walter hadn't been mapping property lines for the county. He'd been mapping a fortress. She picked the letter back up. "Dean knows about the land purchases now. He's already contacted Holcomb. I heard him make the call 2 months before I died. He thinks the land is just real estate. He doesn't know about the minerals, but Holcomb does. They'll come for Ridgecrest, Edith. You're the only one who can stop them." The USB drive contains certified geological surveys, mineral assessments, all 17 land deeds, and trust documentation. The safety deposit box at First Mountain Bank holds notarized originals of everything, plus a preemptive legal injunction I prepared with a conservation attorney, ready to file the moment anyone attempts unauthorized surveying or development. I was a coward, Edith. I should have told you everything decades ago. I should have fought Dean openly instead of hiding behind legal strategies. I was afraid they'd find the land, afraid Holcomb would learn the truth, afraid that bringing you into this would put you in danger. So I stayed quiet. I measured and I mapped and I planned. And I loved you in secret because loving you in public would have exposed everything I was trying to protect. Forgive me if you can, but use what I've left you, not for revenge, for Ridgecrest. Forever yours, Walter. Edith read it 3 times. Then she plugged the USB drive into a laptop Walter had left on the bookshelf, fully charged, waiting for this moment. The files opened. Geological surveys with color-coded mineral deposits, land deeds, trust documents, and one audio file 47 seconds long. She pressed play. Walter's voice filled the cabin, rough, emotional, recorded recently. Edith, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry. Dean knows about the land. He's contacted Holcomb. They'll come for Ridgecrest. The safety deposit box has everything you need. I believe in you. I always did. The recording ended. The cabin was silent except for the wind outside and the sound of Edith's heart beating in her ears. Then, distant but unmistakable, the grinding of an engine climbing the logging road. Someone was coming, and they hadn't been invited. The black SUV came first, followed by Dean's silver BMW. They parked in the clearing like an invasion force, 2 vehicles that cost more than most Ridgecrest families earned in a year, idling in front of a cabin they had no right to approach. Edith watched from the upstairs window. Dean stepped out first. Then a man she'd never seen, tall, gray suit, expensive shoes, already collecting mud. He carried a leather portfolio and moved with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to buying things that weren't for sale. Philip wasn't with them. Just Dean and this stranger, standing in the clearing, studying the cabin with the appraising eyes of men calculating square footage. Edith came downstairs. She opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. She didn't invite them in. Edith? Dean's voice carried the same polished concern he'd used at the will reading. We were worried about you. You left without telling anyone. This place isn't safe for a woman your age, alone out here. The stranger extended his hand. Graham Mercer, Holcomb Energy, Land Acquisitions. His handshake was firm and brief, the kind designed to communicate efficiency. Mrs. Calloway, we understand you've recently inherited some property in this area. We'd like to discuss a purchase offered $200,000 for the cabin and any associated parcels. It's a generous number for rural acreage in this county. $200,000 for 843 acres sitting on $14 million in rare earth minerals. Edith almost admired the audacity. I'm not selling, she said. Dean's jaw tightened. Edith, you don't understand what you're sitting on out here. This property has tax implications, maintenance costs, liabilities you can't handle on a fixed income. Be reasonable. I'm not selling, Dean. Mercer smiled, the patient, rehearsed smile of a man who'd heard this answer before and always gotten a different one eventually. Of course, no pressure, but please take my card. These offers don't stay open indefinitely. He set a business card on the porch railing. They left. Dean's BMW fishtailed on the gravel, spraying mud against the cabin's stone wall. Edith watched them disappear down the logging road, then went inside and drove straight to town. Me was wiping down the counter when Edith pushed through the diner door. She told me everything: the minerals, the land, Walter's letter, Holcomb, Dean's betrayal. Me listened without interrupting. When Edith finished, Me dried her hands on her apron and said, Walter told us this day would come. He said when it did, Ridgecrest would have to decide what kind of town it wanted to be. Me picked up the phone behind the counter and started calling. Within 24 hours, Edith was sitting in her cabin across from Frank Whitfield, a 70-year-old retired environmental attorney who lived 2 towns over and owed Walter a debt from 30 years back. Frank had driven up the logging road in a pickup truck older than most of the trees lining it, wearing a flannel shirt and reading glasses held together with electrical tape. He spread Walter's documents across the drafting table and read them for 2 solid hours without speaking. When he finished, He took off his glasses and looked at Edith with an expression that mixed respect with urgency. These land trusts are airtight. Walter spent 50 years making sure of that. Dean has no legal claim to this property. The deeds predate your marriage. The funding came from a separate inheritance. Everything is clean. He paused. But Holcomb doesn't always work through courts. They work through pressure, county permits, environmental reviews, tax reassessments. They make owning land so expensive and complicated that people sell just to make the headaches stop. "What do I do?" Edith asked. "You file the injunction Walter prepared. You contact the conservation organization that's already expressed interest, and you go public. Holcomb operates in shadows. They hate sunlight." That night, Edith sat on the porch listening to the valley settle into darkness. Crickets and wind and the distant sound of water over rocks. She held Walter's letter in her lap and thought about what Frank had said. Go public. She'd spent 50 years being invisible. Now she had to become the opposite. The next morning, she woke to find orange survey stakes driven into the ground along the logging road, flags marking property lines that weren't Dean's to mark. Someone had been on her land in the dark. Pinned to her front door was Graham Mercer's business card with a handwritten note on the back. "Everyone has a price, Mrs. Calloway. Name yours." Edith pulled the card from the door. She didn't crumple it. She didn't throw it away. She set it on the drafting table next to Walter's maps as evidence. Then she got in her car and drove to First Mountain Bank. The safety deposit box at First Mountain Bank was the size of a bread loaf. Inside it was a war chest, notarized geological surveys with certified mineral assessments, 17 original land deeds, each bearing Edith's name and dated across 5 decades. A formal letter from the Appalachian Conservation Alliance offering $11.2 million for permanent conservation easements on the property. And a sealed legal filing, a preemptive injunction Walter had prepared with a conservation attorney, ready to submit, blocking any unauthorized surveying, mining, or development activity on the land. Edith carried it all out in a cardboard box and drove to Frank Whitfield's office. They filed the injunction that afternoon. She called the conservation organization the next morning. And then she did something Walter never could. She invited a journalist. Cara Brennan was 29, a reporter for the Appalachian Independent covering land rights and mining disputes. She spent 3 days in Ridgecrest interviewing everyone who'd agree to talk. Every single person did. The town hall meeting was held Thursday evening in the church basement. 412 people lived in Ridgecrest, and it looked like all of them came. Folding chairs full, walls lined, children on the floor. The room smelled like coffee and the particular electricity of a community that has been waiting. Edith stood at the front. She was not a public speaker. She'd spent her adult life in the background, but she stood with hands steady on the podium and told them everything. Who she was, what Walter did, what the land contained, what Holcomb wanted, and her plan placed the mineral rights in a community land trust controlled by Ridgecrest residents, ensuring the hills would never be mined, while conservation funds would establish permanent development money for the town. She was halfway through when the church basement door opened. Dean walked in, followed by Graham Mercer and 2 men in suits carrying briefcases. The room went silent. Dean scanned the crowd until he found Edith and walked straight toward the front. "This meeting is premature," Dean announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to boardrooms. "My father's estate is still in probate. Any claims about land ownership are unresolved, and any deals Mrs. Calloway attempts to make are legally questionable. These land purchases were made with marital funds, and as Walter's heir, I have standing to challenge every single deed." Edith didn't flinch. She reached into the cardboard box on the table beside her and pulled out the stack of original deeds. Every purchase was made through a trust your father established in 1974, before our marriage, funded by an inheritance from his Uncle Hank that was never commingled with marital assets. Your father was a surveyor, Dean, but he was also a very careful man. She set the deeds on the podium. I have certified geological surveys, notarized appraisals, and a filed injunction blocking any development activity. I also have a journalist sitting in the third row. Kara raised her hand from the folding chair without standing up. Dean's lawyer leaned in and whispered something. Dean's face went the color of ash. Mercer stepped forward with one last play. Mrs. Calloway, Holcomb has resources you cannot imagine. Legal challenges, environmental reviews, regulatory inquiries. We can make ownership of this land extraordinarily complicated for your little community. The room held its breath. Edith looked at Mercer. She looked at Dean. She looked at 400 faces watching her, farmers, teachers, mechanics, retirees, children, people who had trusted Walter for 50 years and were now trusting her. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her voice was quiet but it carried to every corner of that room. "I spent 50 years married to a man who mapped every inch of these hills. I am standing on ground my husband gave his life to protect. You can bring your lawyers and your reviews. I have 412 neighbors, 843 acres of documented deeds, a filed injunction, and a reporter who would love to write about a mining corporation threatening a 72-year-old widow and a town of 400 people. So please make it complicated. I have nothing but time." The room erupted, not in cheers exactly, but in the sound a community makes when it decides it will not be moved. Applause and voices and me in the back saying, "That's Walter's girl." Dean and Mercer left without a word. Kara's story ran the following week. Regional papers picked it up, then national outlets. Holcomb issued a statement about respecting community stakeholders and quietly withdrew. After the meeting, Dean found Edith alone outside the church. For the first time in 50 years, he didn't look angry. He looked lost. "Did Dad really love you that much?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the question like a boy asking something he was afraid to hear the answer to. Edith looked at him. A 55-year-old man who'd spent his whole life believing his father's love was something you had to compete for, something that ran out if you didn't claim your share. And she realized this story wouldn't end with victory or revenge. It would end with a truth that was harder than either. "Your father loved you, Dean." Edith said it simply, the way you say things that are true and cost you nothing to give. "He just didn't know how to love you and stand up to you at the same time. That was his failure, not loving me more. Failing to show you that love doesn't have to be a competition." Dean stood there under the church steeple with his hands in his coat pockets. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He turned and walked to his car and drove away on the dirt road, and Edith watched his taillights disappear into the trees without feeling triumph or satisfaction, just exhaustion, and a strange, heavy tenderness for a man who had never learned that being loved doesn't require someone else being loved less. Philip sent a letter 2 months later. It arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, postmarked from Connecticut, 2 sentences. "I'm sorry about the will. I knew it wasn't right." It wasn't enough. But it was the first honest thing Philip had said in 50 years, and Edith put it in the drawer beside Walter's letter because honesty, even late, deserves a place to rest. The conservation easement was finalized in March. The Community Land Trust established by April. $11.2 million in permanent funding, enough to rebuild the school, open a health clinic, repair roads, and create a sustainable future without touching the minerals inside those hills. Walter's maps became the founding documents of something that would outlive everyone who tried to destroy it. Edith transformed the cabin into a community meeting space, town council gatherings, Mies dinners, teenagers doing homework at the drafting table. She kept a small cottage on the property for herself. 2 rooms and a porch, enough for a woman who'd learned that needing less isn't the same as deserving less. She taught reading at the library on Tuesdays, planted a garden overlooking the valley, roses and herbs designed to bloom March through November, just like the one she'd left behind, except this one was entirely hers. She attended church every Sunday and sat in a pew nobody else claimed, because it had become hers by the simple act of showing up. On a warm evening in May, Edith hung Walter's surveying compass above the cabin door. Below it, a hand-carved sign, Callaway Commons, where what matters is measured differently. That night on her cottage porch, she opened a journal, the first she'd ever kept, and wrote one paragraph. For 50 years, I thought Walter's silence meant absence. It meant protection. I'm not sure I forgive him, but I understand it now, and I am done being quiet myself. She closed the journal and looked across the valley, where the last light turned the treetops gold. Edith Mee Callaway was 72 years old. She'd spent 5 decades being what everyone else needed: the patient teacher, the invisible wife, the woman who never raised her voice. But here, on ground her husband spent his life protecting, in a town that knew her name before she arrived, she was free. Not happy in the simple way stories pretend. Free in the complicated way that comes when you stop waiting for permission to exist on your own terms. And if you are watching this carrying the weight of years you spent invisible, if you've been told your sacrifice was just caretaking, if you've been erased from a life you built, remember this. Your value was never determined by whether they acknowledged it. Sometimes the people who love us most show it worst. And the life you were supposed to live doesn't always begin when you expect. Sometimes it begins when everything falls away and the only thing left is you, standing on solid ground, finally free. You are not too old. You are not too late. You are exactly where the road was always leading. This story, like every story on this channel, was made for people who refuse to quit on themselves. If Edith's journey moved you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The next story is coming soon, and I don't want you to miss a single word. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their best chapter might still be ahead, because it is.